Basil. Early one morning, while the crusade camped off the paved path through the Shui Mountains, Basil and his master ventured through the meadows to a nearby lake to replenish their supplies before Basil met with his morning patients. Master Watercress enthusiastically identified every sprig and sapling within the new kingdom. Basil learned what his master had meant by claiming Ikasu suffered from an oversaturation of green hues in the countryside. Though pretty, Basil missed the purple leaves of the heliotrope forest. After slipping off his boots and rolling up his trousers, Basil slid into the pond. Its cold touch sent a chill up his spine, even though the water only rustled at his mid-calf. He shuddered as he crept farther in. I hate getting wet. That one is a cypress tree, Watercress said, pointing to a tall, skinny tree from the bank. And this one is a poplar. When Basil came across a watercress plant growing in the pond, he eagerly picked it. What is that you have there? Watercress asked, wading through the water toward him. Basil wasn't certain if the nature of his question posed a test or came from sheer curiosity. He assumed his master was merely taking inventory, and he told him, Watercress, good for reducing blood pressure and filled with nutrients. Ah yes, it has a special place in my heart, Watercress said, smiling. And your name, Basil joked, but the previous question still lingered on Basil's mind, as to whether his master was still treating him as a student or as an equal. What's the matter? Watercress dropped his beaming expression. Basil knew he would ask. He always did, as soon as Basil's mood soured. He hated that Watercress knew him so well. Basil had no mental privacy the way his master did. He never knew what his master was thinking, even though he was his closest relation in the world. Watercress's mind was like an abyss of knowledge and secrets that created an emotional chasm of detachment. I wish I could be proud of my name, Basil said honestly, but avoiding the core issue. How do you mean? It's debatable whether Basil has any healing properties at all. Basil, it's standard for healing mages to have the names of herbs, regardless of their properties. But it's also not an exclusive name. Basil could be a botanist or a chef. I lack identity. You are an excellent chef and botanist, Watercress said. It better describes who you are. You are not resigned to one art. There can be a benefit to having an ambiguous name. In some cases, you can better choose your path. It describes me as a wizard. I might be able to heal someone, but I also might not. And it hurts. I feel like you chose the name because you doubted I'd amount to a full healing mage, because I'm not a sorcerer. Basil didn't understand why he took his irritation out on his master. He knew it was unjustified. He also knew he couldn't stop once he started. He had resented his name for the reasons he had listed, but it wasn't something that bothered him so profoundly to argue about it. I have always believed that you will ascend to greatness, regardless of your career path. I have told you before, but I taught you those other trades because I wanted you to have greater mobility in life, not because I thought you'd fail as a healing mage and needed an alternative path to pursue. If you had found a passion for sculpting or farming or sewing, I wanted to help you pursue it. I wanted to ensure you found purpose in your life rather than force you down a single route. That was my only intention. His master grasped his shoulder comfortingly. Your mother chose your apprentice name because she couldn't choose your name while you lived as a slave, Watercress said. She liked the sound of it. She said it wasn't stuffy, like anise, and that it was comforting and relatable. She wanted you to remember making her favorite olive pesto sauce together when you heard your name. Basil experienced a rapid change of emotions, a cross between intellectual enlightenment and the reminiscent fulfillment upon the return of a precious lost treasure. Why didn't you tell me earlier? By the time you had grown, it had slipped my mind as something I should have told you. I am sorry. I got so preoccupied with filling your head with practical know-how that I forgot to share sentimental history with you as well. Basil nodded, unsurprised. That was Watercress. Anything else I should know? Master Watercress closed an eye as he recalled. Concerning your name, your father lamented that you weren't trained as a bricklayer. He said he would have liked a son named Wythe. Basil smiled. He liked that name too. His master continued. When you were finally old enough for me to claim you as my apprentice, I thought your mother wouldn't allow me to train you, that she would change her request and keep you by her side, despite the consequences. She would have done a fine job raising you, considering how much she loved you. but the fear of the life you would lead as a slave aided her. I promised her I would protect you, and I know it must have taken incredible courage for her to pass you on to the care of a practical stranger for the chance of a better life. Basil wondered if that was why Watercress had been so overly protective of him all this time, to fulfill the promise he had made. His mother's amber eyes could bore into someone by their beauty and their ferocity. Basil had experienced the look often enough himself. After the realization flooded over him, Basil calmed in the palms lapping waves. Anything else? He asked again, curious if he would receive all the answers he had ever desired while drudging through the waters with handfuls of herbs. Watercress's deep-set carob eyes measured him for a moment. You were a chubby baby. His master laughed at his expense. Basil huffed. Okay, anything else? Nothing more comes to mind, but I'll tell you if I remember something. Watercress wouldn't meet his gaze. Uncertain if Watercress was lying to him, Basil turned away to collect the precious herbs. He recognized the importance of making haste and returning to treat any awaiting patients before the soldiers' morning muster. While collecting a clump of yarrow, Watercress said, I've finished composing the new spell tome. I'll deliver it to you while you're seeing your patients. I've written a copy for myself that I will distribute to the other healing mages as well. Thank you, Master, Basil said obligatorily. Despite the value of the tome and the importance of the additional ability it contained, he disliked the prospect of trading fencing practice with his friends or earning gem through odd jobs for learning a new spell. The spell tome contains the ability to create a barrier of healing around a city-sized area of radius. It will last for 1.5 days. I would recommend that you revamp the spell at the same time every day, but I put in the extra half-day failsafe in case it slips your mind or you become preoccupied. This will be a vital tome, not only for you, but for every city and village in our realm. When the barrier of health can be maintained with the power of a spell tome, rather than from a mage's strength, the mage can focus their efforts on emergencies, rather than solely preventative measures. The college can train wizards to perform this tome to protect every village from illness. Basil recognized the importance of the matter, but focused on picking the herbs. Therefore, I could tell the crusade leaders that I can heal the patients now, Watercress said, but I would not want to detract from your business ventures with the merchants. So long as the knights believe I am otherwise occupied, I will not correct them. Basil spun to look at his master. Won't that cause you trouble? So long as everyone is healed, I do not see an issue with my proposed arrangement, Watercress said, with a sly smile. If there's any case too extreme, I might step in without their knowledge. Basil nodded, grateful for his master's consideration. However, I expect you will budget time to learn the new tome, Watercress said with a knowing look. Basil nodded. I will. Before you go off to the mage's college, the greater number of tomes you know, the better, Watercress mentioned a moment later, picking a calamus root. Basil whipped his head to look at his master again, with craving in his heart. I'd give anything to earn the college's accreditation and be properly respected as a master. Basil narrowed his eyes at the blatant but effective manipulation. Once the master and apprentice finished collecting the remedies, they dried their legs on the long grasses near the lake. They checked each other over for lake leeches and other parasites, but found none. I will prepare the herbs for storage while you treat the soldiers, Watercress offered. Thank you. Basil handed his pickings off to his master and departed. A line of patients had congregated near Boss New's cart. What can I help you with? Basil asked his first patient, who clutched at his side. I ate a new fruit that I've never seen before while on the march. It didn't serve me well, the second lieutenant said. I'll make you a ginger tea. It should make you feel better. While Basil brewed the tea, he cast a diagnostic spell to ensure there wasn't a more serious underlying cause to the man's symptom. As Basil moved the spiraling energy through the soldier's digestive tract, he alleviated the man's pain, but also recognized the second lieutenant would heal after ingesting the ginger. To augment the ginger's effect, Basil also gave him a slice of sour spurt. While Basil treated the following patients, Watercress deposited the new spell tome with him. After the morning patients concluded, Basil returned to Boss New's cart with an extra point cut in his gem pouch and the tome in hand. He opened the book to the first page to read over the opening words, Jayeth Sutu Rakni Hifino. After learning the nuanced way to pronounce the words and how to feel while saying the spell, Basil could create the impressive barrier of health. As customary with spell tomes, the entirety of the instructions was written in the holy language. Despite Basil's fluency in the language, the book would still be a challenge to finish due to its sheer length. Master Watercress had written a magical masterpiece. When his master would sell a copy of the work to the college, he would fetch top-tiered gems for it. With the publishing of this spell tome, Watercress would revolutionize the healing mage profession again for the second time. Joining up with the back lines, Basil's friends discussed which legendary creature they would most prefer to eat. Basil was glad to discuss the entertaining topic rather than consider the work required to master the new spell.
I would say a great eland, but I would be too afraid to anger Mao, Brusite said. Therefore, I'd go with an elder deer.
Personally, I'd like something more exotic, Telios said. I want to try wyvern meat.
You'd have the Archdemoness Otia and the High King after you, Basil said. Telios waved him off.
We aren't considering logistics.
Previously, Telios would have said the comment to demean Basil. Instead, he said it with a more congenial tone. I see. That'd still be a shit choice, Ante said, with an asymmetric smile. Carnivores don't taste nearly as good as herbivores.
What would you choose, then?
Telios challenged, without taking offense. Probably the peacock. I generally prefer fowl.
Not the white dove, then? Brusite asked.
A dove isn't a fowl. Basil didn't bother correcting Brusite. Ante seemed to have a similar thought as she pressed her lips together. There's more meat on a peacock.
What about you, Basil? Brusite asked.
Maybe the labat? Maybe the noble strix? I ate a butterfly basilisk as a child. It was nasty, and I was sick for days from the venom, which even my master couldn't treat. I can't imagine the raven basilisk would be any better.
I wonder what the next legendary animal will be, Brusite said.
You mean the one that Ether chooses?
Telios asked. I doubt he interacts with any animals at all. His animal of choice will probably be human, Anates joked. My master once told me that rare animals are caged and brought before Ether for every festival of the wyvern to see if he takes a liking to any, Basil said. What a miserable existence, Anates said. 2 caged animals staring at each other.
Why would you say that Ether's caged? Brusite asked.
It's a social cage of expectation. The Carry know it all too well. Having to conform, walking on 2 legs, wearing non-bloodied furs, speaking the common tongue. All for the sake of propriety. I'm sure it's far worse for Ether than anyone else in the world. I bet he's never had a real run before.
Priests always preach to maintain one's physical health as much as one's mental, emotional, and spiritual. I'm certain the Archspawn is kept in shape, Brusite said.
That's what she's saying, Telios said. He's kept in shape. He probably can't leave the impenetrable castle to exercise out in the wilderness if he wanted to.
The conversation continued until Brusite broke formation to pluck a flower stalk from a nearby plant.
I thought you might like this.
Brusite presented the red flowers to Anates. She eyed them skeptically. Why? Flowers serve a better purpose attached to the plants they grow on. Basil pitied Brusite, whose anticipating expression dropped with his posture at the rejection. He still held the stalks, but lowered them to his side.
What do you like?
Telios asked in the awkward silence that followed. Tools or meat, effort, gifts useful for survival and growth, not garbage that belongs in the compost or midden heap. Some say gladius flowers ward off nightmares. Basil recalled his master's lesson of other herbalists' suspicions. Anates considered the flowers again. Brusite excitedly handed them off. Though she accepted the token of his affections, Basil doubted she found the gift endearing, given that Brusite hadn't known the significance of the plant. While he was happy that his friends had a budding romance, Basil still couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy at the same time. Although Anates was undeniably beautiful, Basil would never interject himself between her and Brusite. Anates also had an extra 8 rotations on Basil, and the difference in age would have been strange anyway. Teleost had no such reservations. After Anates had killed off many of the rapists and felt safe enough to remove her helmet around camp, Teleost attempted to woo her when he wasn't trying to win over one of his male interests from the neighboring campsite. Teleost's efforts with Anates amused Basil, given her outright disfavor for him, regardless of his recent personality transformation. Brusite appears happier than I've ever seen him. Perhaps there's someone out there for me too. Basil considered different ways he might run into someone when the crusade reached the next town. Perhaps the four of them could venture into a tavern. Maybe Watercress might introduce Basil to a mage's apprentice around his age. That seemed much more likely, though if he needed to be wary of mages, perhaps it wasn't as realistic as he initially imagined. His best chance for a sustained relationship would probably be with one of the merchant's children that followed the crusade party. However, he didn't know if there were any his age. When the camp stopped for a midday meal alongside a wild garden, Basil saved himself some effort by pointing out which fruit the soldiers should not pick from the vine that had made the previous patient ill. 9 poked his head around one of the inquisitive soldiers. Basil crouched to speak to 9 after he attempted to hide. "What do you think you're doing?" "Nothing," 9 said immediately. Basil sent him a knowing look, feeling the way he imagined Watercress looked at him. "I might have been trying to overhear which plants make one take ill," 9 confessed. "So that you'll eat them, get sick, and then rescission won't hurt you?" 9's eyes bobbled up and down with his head as he nodded with a frown. "I'm getting close, 9. A few more towns, and I should have enough gem," Basil said, placing a hand on his shoulder the same way his own master had comforted Basil that morning in the lake. "Criath Mosindi," Basil cast. He mentally moved the swirling pool of energy through the young boy's body, directing it with his eyes. 9 giggled from the diagnostic spell's sensation. With the spell, Basil located a few bruises along 9's buttocks and hands. 9 could have told him where the injuries were, but in Basil's experience, Watercress's invention worked faster and provided a more comprehensive and honest physiological story, free from shame. "When does he hit you?" Basil asked while working. "After the services, I have a hard time following along. My imagination gets the better of me, and I can't focus," 9 said. 5 and 18 try to talk him down, but he hits them too if they intervene. I told them they shouldn't." Though Basil pitied his enslaved friends, he needed to learn more about 9. "What do you imagine? Did you see the fire again?" "During the services, I get bored. I create a story to stay awake, but it takes off on its own. I have a hard time remembering details too long afterwards, unless it's really vivid." "When I can afford you, you can do all the daydreaming you want. For now, can you write down what you see after the services? I'd be curious." "I don't know how to write," 9 said. "Rescission never taught me." "Right. I'll teach you then. For now, we can talk about the details you do recall." Basil considered the idea, thought about how he could improve 9's situation, and then cast another spell to reduce the swelling. "Thank you." 9 hugged Basil. Basil hugged 9 back. "We should find Rescission. I'm sure he's worried," Basil said, reluctant to return the boy to his abuser. 9's eyes filled with betrayal. "Soon," Basil promised. 9 neither smiled nor nodded, but he willingly paced forward as Basil guided him toward the merchant caravan that parked behind the soldiers. "Oh, Basil, thank you for returning 9 to me. I'm sorry he troubled you." Rescission grasped 9's forearm tightly, threatening him. 9 glanced away, repressing hysterics. "Not at all," Basil reassured. "I had an idea, though." "What's that?" Rescission asked, adjusting the medium belt he wore around his trousers. Even though Basil hadn't seen 9's bruises, he had sensed their width, and they matched the girth of Rescission's belt. During the evening services, perhaps Faith could use help from 9 as an altar server, or something of the like, Basil said. "Children can be restless when they sit still for too long. Perhaps if he's engaged in the service, then he'll fidget less." 9's face switched from shock to horror from the suggestion, but Rescission smiled. "A superb idea. It troubles me that 9's restlessness has disturbed our Faith's brothers, during the holy services no less. But you are onto something there." "I wouldn't say he's been a disturbance, but it might be nice for Faith to have the help." "You are truly a devout brother. We should propose this idea to Faith together tonight." "I would be delighted to." Basil plastered a fake smile across his face. All Basil wanted was to prevent 9 from being beaten until he could become his new caregiver. 9 shot an accusatory glare at Basil. As Basil turned away from the slave trader to claim his midday meal, he mouthed the word, "soon," back to 9. After the crusade set up camp for the evening, Basil skipped out on sword training to approach Faith with precision about the idea to incorporate 9 into the service. Afterward, he would obligatorily attend the sermon with precision, but that night, Faith held individual meditation sessions rather than a full service. Basil and Precision were among the first in line, and thus did not have to wait all night to be seen. Wasting time in line to see the priestess was low on Basil's priority list, but he wanted Precision to regard him warmly, so he would eventually sell 9 to him. Once Precision concluded his session, Basil entered Faith's massive tent. The interior was decorated with bright pinks and orange blankets and tapestries, and incense burned in a dish that sat between Faith and an empty floor pillow. Basil had never attended a private meditation session with a spiritual leader, but Watercress had led him through a few meditation exercises from time to time when he thought Basil would benefit from it. Faith sat cross-legged on her pillow. Her wavy light gray hair splayed along her white robes, creating a tent around her body. She must have been 140 for how wrinkled she was.
"Is there anything you would like to focus on during your time here?" Faith asked.
Not in particular. Basil took a seat across from her on the empty pillow. The incense burned brighter once Basil sat. The smell bothered him. I usually pray to Tome, but there's nothing in particular that I want to pray for today.
"Is there anything you would like to focus on during your time here? Anything you would like to improve for yourself? Any situations that you would like to evaluate how you could have handled better? Any relations you would like to mend?"
Not really, Basil said, quickly trying to think of something. He could dissect why he argued with his master more, but in his heart he knew the reason.
"Do you need assistance working on your emotional well-being, emotional intelligence, or mental well-being?"
Basil shook his head, a droplet of sweat forming down the side of his temple. "It's foolish. This makes me nervous when I've performed life-saving surgeries."
"Perhaps we can discuss Fontame's teaching," she suggested.
"Sure," Basil agreed, relieved she picked a topic for him. Faith smiled reassuringly at his nervous disposition.
"Fontame teaches us to make the correct choice when faced with temptation. Sometimes it can be difficult to determine what temptations are even before us, however. It can present itself in various forms. Meditating and knowing your own mind will help you to recognize enticement," they said.
Basil refrained from rolling his eyes. There weren't any demons coming after him. No one cared about a lowly ex-slave turned wizard apprentice. Temptation was the concern of Spawn and Royals.
"Many people may believe that temptation only presents itself to those of authority or those of influence, to the rich and powerful. But that is not the case," Faith continued. "Most temptation occurs at the individual level."
Basil's interest piqued.
"The decisions to do right do not only present themselves in high-stakes situations, they come every day. Obvious ones are when someone needs an ally, and you stand up for them against oppressors. Perhaps your master asks you to help someone, and the right decision is to obey. Perhaps he asks that you do something unethical, and then the right choice is to rebel. Perhaps friends seek vengeance, but they need forgiveness instead."
Basil didn't stop himself from rolling his eyes.
"A romantic interest could likewise prove to become a temptation," Faith prompted.
"How could that be?" Basil asked, skeptical. "Angelism teaches us that so long as love is consensual, it is not immoral."
"Any person can lead you down the wrong path, to act and behave in ways that are selfish at the expense of others, in an unnecessarily violent way, in a way that might shorten your lifespan, any unholy way."
"Do you think those people will still be saved?" Basil asked, unsure where the question stemmed from. "Those who are selfish, and those who are violent. Master Watercress had acted in my self-interest at the potential expense of the health of the crusade. He can always heal an ailment better than I could in any situation. His magic adapts to individual circumstances to handle the nuance of each injury and disease, whereas I'm restricted to the magic sealed within the spell tomes. Was that immoral? Should I be mistrustful of my master because of his decision? Am I a bad person because I wanted to go along with his strategy for my plan to free a slave. Am I wrong to intentionally mislead rescission into a feigned friendship to improve my chances to purchase 9?
Life is complicated. Blanket statements never apply to everyone. Motivations are messy. Intentions are often misunderstood. Trade-offs are sometimes required. What's important is that you make decisions that you can live with. And if you regret a decision, you remedy the situation to live a life you can accept. There's never a point of no return. I do not believe that evil people exist in this world.
Pleasantly surprised, Basil enjoyed speaking with faith. Are the demons and archdemons evil?
I do not believe so. I think they are suffering, and they too are still in need of love and attention. They were once human, were they not? We have historically built shrines to demons, and we hold festivals for them. Perhaps our ancestors initiated these traditions because they held some wisdom about the demons we have since lost.
I had never questioned why we celebrate the demons along with the angels.
Too often, we overlook the pain of others and cast blame onto them for their actions that stem from such agonies. Demons remind us of such follies.
Thank you, Basil said, dipping his head to her. You've given me something to consider. The kindly woman bowed her head in return.
I'd look forward to a future conversation,
she said as Basil left her bright tent. While crossing the Ikazuish countryside, Basil had sat in Boss New's cart, alternating between helping Billet sharpen axes and reading his master's spell tome. Basil had finished the chapter describing the intonation of the first word of the spell, Jayeth. Being fluent in the holy language, Basil already knew how to pronounce the word, and that it translated to the command of maintain something. In the following section, Watercress had written that one should have in one's heart whether the health barrier was to move with a given target or to remain stationary. As well, the spell could last for as long as a day and a half, as his master claimed, but if the caster wished for a shorter duration, that needed to be established while speaking the first word. The placement of the barrier would need to be established later in the spell. Flipping ahead, the following chapters detailed how to say the other words, Sutu, Rakni, and Hifino, and what to think and how to feel when casting the spell. After those chapters came the mechanics, physically, chemically, and biologically, how the spell maintained the barrier of health, how the spell instructed the immune system within every human's body, how to develop antibodies in response to all malignant bacteria, viruses, and fungi. There were also chapters detailing how to encourage the reversal of adult cells into stem cells and how to prevent free radicals from triggering cancerous growths. Basil would not enjoy the organic, alchemical, and biomechanical chapters, but he aimed to complete the chapters focused on linguistics and phonology before the crusade reached Trelia. However, before they arrived at Ikazu's capital, there was another stop scheduled in the city of Nanvia first. Boss New recounted the parable of gratitude, interrupting the account to give his oxen a command like gi or ha until he finished his tale and said, "Whoa," to halt the oxen in a bower outside of Nanvia.
I'll be helping the soldiers load fresh supplies into the cart to make sure your goods are secured when they are. Otherwise, they might get tossed about or buried under sacks of food, Boss New said.
I'll vacate so I won't be in the way, Billet said, rising from the cart and hopping out of it. I'll wager that there might be some work in the local craftsman guild for a blacksmith. I'll do the same, Basil said.
Check the craftsman guild for work, Boss New asked.
The comment gave Basil pause. Perhaps he would. He knew masonry, smithing, and glass blowing, thanks to his master. He might check if there was any work he was qualified to tackle. I meant that I would also vacate, Basil said, smiling.
I know. I was joking with you.
Basil followed behind Billet to discover the craftsman guild within the city. Nanvia was beautiful. Steeply pitched roofs that once endured long periods of rain and snow now stood purely for decorative purposes. The Ikazuish homes had a combination of stonework and brick to complement the half-timbering. Miniature gardens filled window boxes and little swatches of clover stretched between the road and the homes. Basil was uncertain if there was a wealthier section of town. All the homes and shops were similar. However, based on the placement of ornamental signs and embellished arched doorways, some of the shops stacked on top of each other in quirky fashions. In town squares, masterfully carved limestone statues greeted visitors with extended hands and open arms. In large lead glass bay windows, cotton tunics, trousers, cloaks, skirts, and dresses advertised the contents of various clothing stores. Another shop sold stacks of parchments, inks, sealing wax, and quills, and the next sold crafting supplies. The variety of artisan stores and wares excited Basil. He nearly wanted to practice his sculpting by attempting to carve a similar replica of one of the city's welcoming statues. White, black, and mint Ikasuish banners flew from almost every building. The city folk didn't intentionally scrutinize Basil, and they had better spirits than those in Vetron's cities. If he caught their glance, they would give him a smile before passing on. Most wore bright yellow and greens, with few blues and brown hues sprinkled in. Some carried wares related to their work. Caskets of ales and wines lumbered down the street next to self-pulled carts filled with crops, some exotic and some familiar. Emboldened birds pecked at the fresh produce. Basil had to remind himself to focus on following Billet to the guild hall rather than exploring the city. Standing at 10 stories tall, the Craftsman's Guild Hall loomed over the rest of the town, even the Lord's Manor and the city's cathedral. A nifty invention at the top of the hall used mirrors to redirect the twin suns' light onto a flat vertical plane that assisted in keeping the time. In the middle of the city, it was harder to judge the sun's position, with the roof lines partially obscuring the sky, and Basil appreciated the invention once he understood how to read the display. Apparently, it was past second sun high. If the management and administration soldiers completed their business by the next morning, Basil would have to choose a short job to finish by second sunset. If he found work and supplies quickly, he'd have 2 turns of the suns to work. At most, he'd expect a table cut. He wondered if Nanbia had a healing mage. If it didn't, he considered seeking out the town botanist or herbalist instead. In the same 2 turns of the suns, he could heal dozens of patients and earn 3 times as much. There was no guarantee that there would be that many patients available, and if the city did have a healing mage, none of the patients would choose to see him, a wizard, instead of their residential sorcerer. He might do petty jobs for a healing mage, but a master would expect an apprentice to complete chores for free. When a patrol of Imperial soldiers garbed in silver armor noticed him loitering across from the guild hall, Basil pretended to be interested in the wares of the shop behind him. As he acted, he studied the illustrations of wanted criminals in addition to the main headlines of the Transportation Mage's news flyers. Rhyseglae sees Spawn on the northern border, intent on devastating immortal souls. Spawn's son seeks vengeance. Read Harrow's recruitment journey. Vahantry aid demonist agenda. Attacks against Crusade permit Rhysig advances in Angelism's Holy Land. Below were additional details of the guild's attacks on King Tanzanite's forces. There was speculation as to the angering of a desert spirit or a sand elemental, as the troops had encountered difficulties before reaching the Rhyseglae's location. The story cut off after that, and Basil would need to purchase the parchment to read the rest of the details. Basil often forgot the reason for the crusade. His personal issues and aspiration to be named a master clouded his concern for the rest of the world. That and his self-assigned side quest to help Nine. Just then, Billet departed the guild hall with a client. Basil weaved between the city folk to cross the street. Inside of the guild hall, the building was airy and well organized. Large signs directed the blacksmiths, roofers, masons, sculptors, glassblowers, and painters to designated areas. In each space, advertisements hung on nearby sections of the walls to recruit each artisan for the desired type of work. Additionally, crafters meandered in the sections, discussing the art of their trade. In the back, a bar served drinks to those waiting for work or for a crafter. A large crowd waited by the sign for blacksmiths, and Basil thought it unsurprising Billet found work so quickly. But Basil did not want to run into him accidentally. Basil knew the blacksmith trade, and by his age, he would be considered a full-fledged craftsman. He wanted to use that assumption to his advantage, and he hadn't wanted Billet to correct that notion. I can charge the full rate that way, too. When Basil noticed a lone woman wearing a green dress next to the masonry sign, he headed in her direction. "Hello, miss. My name is Wythe," Basil lied, providing the name his father would have given him, since it had recently been on his mind. "Can I assist you with something?" Something seemed off about the woman, but Basil couldn't quite place what it was. Her heart-shaped face had perfect proportions, but he didn't spend any further thought on the matter once she smiled at him. "Oh yes, thank you. I need someone to help repair my garden wall. The last mason I hired was arrested before he finished the job, so it had been worked on, but is unfinished," the lady said. "I can still work with that," Basil said. "Did the man leave his tools behind by any chance?" He wanted to kick himself for being so stupid, If he needed to purchase his own supplies, it would cost him more than the job would earn and severely deplete his savings. Don't you have your own? I do, but I'm traveling with the crusade party. It would be convenient to use what's already there rather than lug the extraneous resources around. Given that, I will only have time for the day's work. If the job takes longer, you will have to return to find yet another mason tomorrow. He desperately hoped she wouldn't probe further. Of course, the woman agreed. Basil could see how she could ask any number of questions to unravel his story, but luck was with him. Her mind proved not to be an inquisitive one, and she accepted the faulty tale at face value. I'll show you the way to my home if it pleases you. Please. Basil gestured to the door of the guild hall. The pair left the hall and strolled through the streets to one of the homes. Inside, decorative ceramic plates and bowls lined shelving throughout the kitchen. To the side, a brick fireplace baked a pie with a diminutive flame, and the home smelled of cherries and warm cinders. Finally, Basil passed an oak dining set with plump cushions on his way to the back door. Basil loved the place. Compared to the stark splendor and superficial grandeur of Vetron's homes, Nanvia was welcoming and cozy. Fruit bushes filled the small rear yard's garden patch. Overseeing the garden was a window with a repeating diamond pattern laced in the leaded glass, which provided a glimpse into the comfortable dining area. This was the wall I was talking about. She pointed to a brick wall that separated part of her yard from her neighbor's. Designed with stretcher bonds, only the longer sides of the bricks showed. Much of the mortar between the rows had eroded and needed fixing. It was enough work for one turn of the sun's, but Basil would need to find additional work afterwards. He would also need to reassess his earnings. Can you fix it? The woman asked. The courses have eroding beds and perpends. Basil rubbed his finger over the crumbling mortar, or lack thereof. He hoped his use of the masonry jargon would convince her he knew what he was doing. With a bit of tuck pointing, I can fix it. Thank you so much, she said. Let me retrieve the supplies the last mason left behind. I didn't want to leave them out to rust in the nightly rains. Thank you. Basil examined the other side of the wall and probed the recent additions. Similar wear existed on the other side. Basil wondered the wall's age as the woman returned with a chisel, stiff bristled brush, trowel, and spoons. She also deposited a bucket filled with dry lime mortar next to the tools. Basil searched for a water source. There's a well a block away. I can fill a bucket. No need. I'll get the water myself, Basil said, picking up the chisel and brush to remove the old mortar. For a time, his employer watched him work, then returned to her home. A pleasant breeze whistled through the wooden wind chimes and whisked the sun's heat away, leaving him feeling constantly refreshed while working. After spending so long in the frigid temperatures, Basil supposed he would be fond of Ikasu, but this kingdom had already stolen his heart from Vetron in the short days he had been there. A turn of the suns later, after listening to a humorous conversation from the neighbors comparing the sizes of their garden's crops, he completed repointing the wall. Certain the neighbors weren't paying attention to him, he cast a spell to purposefully cut himself on the back of his forearm in a manner that looked like an accident, then knocked on the back door. The owner opened the door. I finished with the wall if you'd like to take a look. She withdrew from her home and examined the new mortar that fit neatly between the bricks. This is fine work, thank you so much, she said, pulling out a table cut and handing it over to Basil. It was too much for the time he had invested. Also, why? You should take those tools with you, she said, almost as an afterthought, if there's room in the Crusade's caravan. Will the other mason not be returning for them? Basil hadn't wanted to pry too far into why her previous hire had been detained. Better not. I found him trying to lift my gem chest, so I turned him over to the authorities. Even if he does escape the law's judgment, I do not intend to return his equipment to him so he can swindle someone else. You would make better use of them, she said. Basil nodded, feeling better about commandeering the tools. You're bleeding! Yes, you're right. Could I trouble you to point me in the direction of the local healer? I'll walk you there myself. Concern brewed in her eyes. It's a minor scrape. I'll be fine to find the office on my own. You got hurt while working. I should pay for your medical expenses, she said. I couldn't accept any more of your kindness, Basil said, even though he wanted to. Let me at least give you a point cut to cover the visit. For 9. Okay, he said without trusting his gut. You have my gratitude. I didn't get your name. Mill. Thank you, Mill. Can you give me the direction to the healer's office? She gave him the gem and the instructions while eyeing his dripping wound. Quickly, he collected the mason tools in the mortar bucket and headed in the respective direction. For as long as he was in view of the woman's house, he clutched at his injury. Once he crested a hill and turned the corner, he cast Sutaya Thiri and healed the cut. He hadn't intended to defraud the woman out of additional gem from his intentional wound, but rather wanted a reason to seek directions to the healer's office. Although the deception shamed him, he was that much closer to purchasing Nine's freedom. Basil wiped the lingering blood from his arm and followed the route to the healing mage's office. A myriad of plants enveloped the office, from the window boxes to the garden plots to the roof to the hanging baskets. Even watercress hadn't grown plants on their roof. Perhaps it wouldn't be a bad idea when they returned to Vetron. However, Basil guessed he would be tasked with climbing up to water said plants. Perhaps he would keep his mouth shut. Basil opened the office door and cautiously entered. He felt vulnerable, presenting himself to the healer without his master. The office was like Rosemary's, with an addition to care for patients off to the side.
"Good day, traveler," the healing mage called from the mint plant he watered toward the opposite side of the office. He was about Watercress's age and garbed in periwinkle robes. "Hello, I wanted to announce myself. My name is Basil of Sithica. My master and I are in town for the rest of the day. We'd be happy to exchange supplies if you need anything." "It's a pleasure to meet you, my lad. I'm Turmeric," the store owner said. "Watercress came by earlier and mentioned you were in town. It's good to put a face to the name. I've heard a lot about you."
"You have?" Over the rotations, Basil had posted his master's letters to Turmeric, but he hadn't known who he was otherwise.
"Of course, your master is exceptionally proud of you. We're good friends from the Mages College. I'm a wizard like you, but he always jokes about how you surpassed my skills by the time you were a tot."
A surge of pride welled in Basil from his master's praise. He leaned against Turmeric's counter, eager to get comfortable and hear more. What was Master Watercress like back then?
Mischievous.
Mischievous?
Oh, yes, he had a knack for pursuing adventures and seeking dangerous knowledge, Turmeric said. He was also popular with our female classmates, and a few of the male ones, too.
"He was?" Basil asked, even more skeptically. Either Turmeric didn't know Watercress at all, or Basil didn't.
"That's right. And it wasn't only the healing mages. He was on top of the class, more skilled than most of our teachers. Of course, he had his admirers. Lucky for me, he was so powerful because I wouldn't have passed without his diagnostic spell tome. I can't believe I haven't seen any more from him in such a long time."
I had always assumed Watercress had written the tome for me. "So you two were close?"
"We were. There were 6 of us in our friend group, but let me tell you, Poppy was the only one for him."
Basil perked up. Watercress often mentioned his friend Master Poppy from school, but it seemed like half of his letters were addressed to her. What happened? Different monarchs hired them?
Everyone thought they'd marry and settle down in either Sithica or Trelia, but they never did. I assumed they had a falling out, because less than a rotation out of school, Watercress took you on as an apprentice.
They still could have been together.
It's a full-time job being a teacher, and it's a full-time job being a new husband. If anyone could have pulled it off, it would have been Watercress. But in his letters, he emphasized how much he wanted to focus on your upbringing and ensure he did everything correctly. He always puts all of himself into whatever he takes on, and he chose you.
He chose me over the woman he loved? Bittersweet sentiments raged within Basil. I feel as close to him as my own parents, but why would he make that sacrifice for me? To change the subject, Basil asked, "What adventures did he go on? Did you go with him?"
"I can't believe he hasn't told you. What else could there possibly be to discuss? Herbs and healing practices?"
Turmeric asked, outraged. "He mostly only relays his knowledge. I don't know much of his earlier life," Basil said, feeling awkward.
Every spare moment, he searched for answers lost to time. He was always sneaking back into the college after curfew. One time, the 6 of us went searching for the lost population of Raven Basilisk, based on the historical notes dated from Cosaire's age.
Why did Watercress never mention this? Knowing him, he probably didn't want to give me any ideas when I eventually attended the college myself. Did you find them?
We did. Nasty creatures. You wouldn't believe how big they are. I couldn't even get a good reading on them when we encountered one in the mountain caves. They're devious, too. Make you think you're losing your mind. Make you feel safe when you're in danger of them swallowing you whole. You wouldn't expect they could, but it's true.
Why did you go looking for them? Basil leaned in, hanging on Turmeric's words.
Your master wanted to find all of the legendary beasts. It might have been to win a bet, or it might have been to prove how clever he was.
He never told me why. Mostly, he pursued them with Poppy, but they needed assistance for the raven basilisk, so they bothered to bring the rest of us along. The basilisks are by far the most dangerous of all the beasts, so I can't blame him. Would have been nice to go searching for the white doves instead. A wyvern's not more dangerous than a raven basilisk? Basil asked, curious how the two legendary reptiles compared to one another. Because Basil had only been familiar with butterfly basilisks, which could fit coiled in his palm, he assumed that the raven basilisk was only marginally larger, perhaps the size of an owl, or a raven. He couldn't see how something that much smaller than a wyvern could pose a more substantial threat. A wyvern is dangerous to a raven basilisk, as a salamander would be to a flaming elfin. Basil tilted his head in consideration. But all of his travels stopped once he was named a master, Turmeric said. I suppose he had his fill of adventures. Basil had pondered why Watercress hadn't sought additional magical avenues, why he was content to not pursue the job of the high healing mage, and why he would prefer to read of fantastical journeys rather than live them, especially if he had enjoyed that life in his time at the college. Perhaps Turmeric did know Watercress better than Basil did. Reflecting on his upbringing, Basil had resented Watercress for constantly forcing him to learn and restricting his playtime with his friends in Xalaphin's Manor. He had been a selfish pupil, never taking an interest in his teacher. That was likely part of the reason Basil had such a hard time reading Watercress's intentions, whereas his master knew Basil's mind arguably better than he did. Could you perhaps help me heal a few ailments? Turmeric pointed in the direction of the infirmary. When Watercress stopped by earlier, he mentioned he had his hands full with protecting the crusade, but that you took on the occasional patient. I would heal them if I could, but I have long forgotten the tomes I would need to complete their treatment. Some might not make it with herbal remedies alone. I can take a look, Basil said, sitting down his unexplained bucket of masonry supplies next to the door. But if there are any who require more extensive treatments, I might ask my master to reconsider. I'm sure you'll do fine. Turmeric led Basil toward the sickbeds. A copy of Watercress's newest spell tome balanced on the ledge of Turmeric's desk. Like Basil, Turmeric would need weeks, if not months, to learn the casting. Laying in a row of cots across from the wizard's desk were 3 suffering patients. One had a bad eye infection, another suffered from an extensive rash, and the last experienced organ failure. If left untreated, all 3 had the potential to perish. Basil knew he could cure the first 2 patients, but he would need to determine the underlying problem for the last. Has she lost her vision? Basil moved to the first cot. Not yet. Good. Basil cast his diagnostic spell to identify the bacterium that caused the eye infection, then quickly cast Vayathpon-Shirai to kill the invading prokaryotic cells. Turmeric's herbs would have to suffice for the remainder of her healing. With the bacteria wiped out, her eyes should recover. A shaky, "Thank you," sounded from the patient behind him. A rash covered the entirety of the next patient's body. It's poisoned sticker syndrome, Turmeric said, to save Basil the trouble of discerning it for himself. Basil cast Namayath Muyan Shirai to destroy the structure of the toxic antigens in the man's body. Kidney stone, Turmeric said before Basil could ask about the final patient. The patient smelled foul and soaked in brown urine stains. He clutched at his abdomen in agony. Basil cast Kamayath Muyan Ru Niliayath Koni and Kryath Mosindi to respectively dislodge the stone and to provide immediate pain relief as the deposit snaked through the man's urinary system. The lack of screaming signaled that Basil performed the numbing correctly. The 2 healers ensured that all 3 patients recovered after the elimination of the leading causes of their ailments. Basil smiled once their conditions improved and felt a fleeting connection with each person. After the 3 paid for their treatment, Turmeric took Basil aside and gave him a single cut, the equivalent of 100 coins and worth more than his earnings from repairing Mill's wall, even with the extra from his self-inflicted wound. Basil reconsidered which line of work he should generally seek in the future. You do not have to pay me, Basil attempted to say. Watercress told me about your plan, and I think it's a good cause, he said with a wink. Besides, you did the most important part. I've been treating them for weeks. They would have died in those beds if it weren't for you. They would not have died. Watercress would have saved them if Basil couldn't have, but Basil knew his master intentionally left them to Basil's care. It reinforced the idea that his master trusted his competence. but he couldn't help question the ethical implications of needlessly prolonging their suffering. Again, he thought of the boy who would soon be his future apprentice, and he shoved his misgivings aside. Basil graciously accepted the payment. "If you will excuse me, I will take my leave now. I have a new tome to learn." Basil glanced to the same book on Turmeric's desk. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Master Turmeric. I hope we meet again someday." "Of course. It's been a pleasure to meet you too, Basil, and thank you again for your help." Basil bowed out of the office, remembering to grab the masonry bucket. Once Basil closed the door, he looked out and took in the landscape. From the healer's office, he could see the countryside stretch back toward the Sushui Mountains. It was a beautiful sight, with the variety of colors rolling along the hill crests and bordering the river. He understood why the city's name translated to bright in the holy language. Basil regretted not spending additional time in Nanbia, but they had to continue on. Lugging the bricklaying supplies back to Boss New's cart, there was only enough room to stack the bucket on top of his supply pack due to the addition of new supplies. He traded the bucket for his tent and pack. Boss New eyed the bucket, but did not ask why Basil brought it along. Basil located his friends by a smaller fire, and he set up his tent behind Anastase's before eating with them. Anastase excused herself unexpectedly before Basil sat, and when Basil noticed Brucite's and Teleos' faces, he wondered if there had been an argument. "How are you both doing this fine evening?" Basil asked, lightly, to undercut their serious expressions. "Brucite's got trouble." "How's that?" "He keeps letting his idiot shine through." "What this time?" Basil asked. "Hey!" Basil raised an eyebrow, expecting Brucite to accept the truth and explain the situation. "I never know what to say to her. I don't know if she even likes me anymore. I don't know if she liked me initially either," Brucite said. "It might have been more of a situational relationship. If I hadn't saved her life at the Rhyme Viaduct, I bet she would never have given me a second glance." "Clearly this chivalrous act isn't working," Teleos said. "It's not an act. That's how my parents raised me." "Do you want advice, or do you want to vent?" Basil asked. "I need advice," Brucite said with a pleading expression. "Well, if you want her to have a reason to want you around, then you have to adapt to her," Basil said. "Protecting one another will go a long way in terms of instinctual appeal, but it isn't enough to form a relationship on." "How would you know?" Teleos asked Basil snidely. As a breathing resident of Sithica, Teleos would have heard Basil's miserable failure at his attempt of a relationship with Zelophin. "Master Watercress had a book on the biology of attraction," Basil said. "Your master seems to have a book on everything. I can't imagine how all those books fit in your little office." Basil looked to Brucite, whose head was in his hands. "Regardless, Brucite, you know her. You know of her culture, even if you don't know every nuance. Think of something she would appreciate." "What?" He raised his head to look at Basil with desperation in his eyes. "She's a practical person. Try giving her something useful." "I don't want to burden her with more garbage to lug around." "Cook her something, then. Back in the wastelands of Vetron, she brought us food so we wouldn't starve, but also to show her favor for us as friends. Now, we're in a land that's bountiful with food. I'm sure it can't be too hard to find supplies to make her a specialty meal, rather than the generic stuff we get from the armies, hunters, and culinary specialists. I bet she'd appreciate it," Basil said. "Don't tell her I admitted this, but she's a better hunter than I am. Why would she want me to hunt for her? I'd just ruin it." "She is a better hunter than you are, and she knows you know it. But Basil's right. Unless you're expecting a miracle, you gotta try something." "I don't know how to cook," Brucite said. "That's servant work." Basil couldn't roll his eyes any harder than he did. Teleos covered his face with his palm in irritation. "Let's catch a fish at the next stream we find, and then we'll teach you how to cook it. Teleos, do you have any supplies Brucite could borrow?" Basil asked. Teleos smiled, feeling appreciated. "I have a spare rod in one of the oxen carts." "Think you can help this oaf get a fish?" Basil asked. "If anyone can, it should be me," Teleos said. "Although, I did explain the process to him already." "I ignored you," Brucite admitted. "I don't blame you. I was a prick," Teleos said. "Couldn't really help it, though." "Glad you're better now." "Yeah. Anyway, I'm not familiar with which fish live in Ikasu, but I'm guessing we might just have to get creative with the bait." "Whatever is living in the mud banks is probably their natural diet," Basil said. Teleos touched his finger to his nose and pointed at Basil. "That's what I would use." "Should we try tonight?" "It might not keep until tomorrow's meal. As it is, we should find some salt to store the fish if we can't cook it right away, Basil said. As part of the management and administration rate, I happen to know where those crates are kept, Telios said. Perfect. I'll keep an eye out for fresh herbs, but if I can't find any, then I'll raid the stores that I have. Between the three of us, we might have a chance to make something edible, Basil said. I should retire. I need to rest before bed.
Brusite, you need to be more careful. That's the second time that you've gotten the hook stuck in my hand,
Telios said, brimming with vehemence as Basil healed the wound again. The three men had limited success in their venture of catching a fish when the crusade stopped for its midday meal. Nestled along the bank, between crop fields and a mill, Telios had shared the wisdom of the fishermen with them, and it still hadn't helped Brusite's chances. Their time was expiring, and Basil desired to steal the rod and catch the fish himself. Brusite's impatience had been the source of Telios' injuries, and Basil wanted to return to fill his stomach. On either fish or rations, he didn't care which. At this rate, we'll have to put the fish in a salt crate and store it for dinner. There's no way we'll have time to cook it before we have to move on. Besides, she definitely ate already. At this rate, we won't catch a fish until we stop for dinner, Basil grumbled, annoyed with his friend's inability to follow simple directions.
I'll have it this time.
Brusite focused on rethreading an insect through the hook. He cast the line again, and he waited. The pole tugged. Brusite pulled on the string to reel in the hook as Telios had taught him. When the fish separated from the stream, Telios grabbed its flailing body. Carefully, he tried to unhook the fish's mouth, but Brusite was still spastically reeling in the line, so the fish popped out of Telios' hands, and the hook snagged at the digit of his index finger.
Brusite, stop taking in the line!
Telios yelled at him through the pain.
Follow a simple instruction, won't you?
While the fish flopped on the ground, Brusite asked, Is that a trout? I should throw it back and catch something that tastes better.
Don't you dare,
Telios said, wrapping his finger in his shirt to stop the bleeding.
She might like it, you don't know.
Basil motioned to heal Telios, but Telios waved him away with his unhurt hand.
Kill the stupid fish first.
Basil grabbed at the flailing fish and pinned it to the earth without injuring himself. Carefully, he unstrung the hook. The fish's gasps came slower and slower. Basil could sense the suffering caused by the fish's suffocation. To cease its pain, Basil cast the same spell on the fish that had killed Telios' tumor. He silenced the cells in the fish's nervous system for an instantaneous death.
If you think so, Brusite said uncertainly, I would prefer to hold out for a tallowtail or something more appetizing.
You can't hold out for that. I doubt they're native here. A trout is probably the best pickings we're going to find. We'll be happy to leave you, though. You can catch up when you've caught one of your own,
Telios said. Telios turned his back on Brusite, and Basil followed soon after, fish in hand.
Wait, no, I need the fish!
Brusite followed Basil for it. Basil had enjoyed exchanging glances with Telios at Brusite's privilege. When it was just him and Brusite as friends, Basil had to bury those opinions.
Can you, Telios asked, again?
He moved his skewered index finger toward Basil, but didn't unwrap it from his shirt. Basil understood the request and passed the fish off to Brusite. He unthreaded the hook and patched up Telios' skin again, but Basil didn't take the fish back once he finished. You can carry that yourself, Basil snapped at Brusite. He wasn't about to play lackey when the effort was to help him. Telios didn't bother to look back when Brusite asked him next for the same favor. Telios took the multiple stabbings well. Had Basil been skewered once, he would have deserted Brusite. Perhaps Telios was more accustomed to the pain than Basil was. It was lucky that any time Brusite's hook had neared Basil, it had slid across his skin rather than impaled him.
Follow me, Brusite. I'll show you where you can store him, and I'll talk to the oxen cart driver for you.
Telios took the fishing pole back from Brusite, who had carelessly swung the free hook around as he carried it. Basil left the two to find some leftover rations before the culinary specialists packed them up. Thank you for helping him, Anate said from behind Basil when he sat to eat. I hope that was entertaining for you. It was, actually, she said, but it makes you and Telios better friends to him for it. Next time, Telios will catch the fish, and we'll claim it's from Brusite, Basil said, or we'll hunt rabbit. Anyway, I hope it's the most delicious catch you ever eat in your life. I'm allergic to fish. Basil smiled with a crazed showing of teeth. As close as he was to strangling Brusite, he came closer to throttling Anates. Would you mind teaching him how to cook it anyway? She asked. He should know how to prepare food, and this is a good motivator for him to learn. She stared at Basil intently, as if trying to say more in her statement than she had. Basil didn't understand her underlying meaning. What? She shook her head. It would merely be a valuable skill for him to have, is all. Basil's brows drew together skeptically. Regardless of what Anastase's true intentions were, he understood the need and agreed to follow through with her request. Do me a favor and don't tell him of my allergy. I want to see the look on his face after he goes through the effort.
You were mean.
And he's spoiled, she snapped. He would die in the wilderness. You should have seen him hunting rabbits. It's a weakness to not have essential life skills. But the more emotion he ties to his lessons, the better he'll remember them, especially if he's in distress. If he happens to make a great expression in the process, then it's an added benefit.
I don't disagree with you, but it's still cruel.
Basil's main scruple against the idea was her pleasure derived from Bruside's wasted effort. Sometimes cruelty is what it takes. Wouldn't you agree? Basil considered his deception of Mill and Nandia, his manipulation of Rescission to buy 9, and his master's concealed tome. I don't want to, but yes. Yes, I do, Basil admitted, knowing his own heart too well.